Hello everyone, Inquisitor Vaughn here, and in today's video I wanted to share with you all 3 reasons why I prefer using Bolterjugend Space Marines over even GW's Space Marine range. The first and primary reason that I prefer Bolterjugend sculpts for my Space Marines is because I think that they are continuing the legacy of the Warhammer 40k Space Marines in a way that is familiar and nostalgic to me. I've told the story before on the channel, but I became interested in Games Workshop and Warhammer 40k when I was in middle school. I couldn't afford the miniatures back then, so I would spend my time in the computer lab researching as much as possible and looking at the miniatures online. I would even go so far as to create my own ways of playing the game, from using a pencil and graph paper to printing out pictures of the miniatures and standing them up at their bases and playing a game using made up rules with my friend Casey at the cafeteria table. I was a hardcore fan of Space Marines and Warhammer 40k before I could even afford it. For years, I would forget about the hobby as I experienced the growing pains of life in high school, but I got back into the hobby in college after reading the Space Wolf Omnibus by William King. This time, I could actually afford the miniatures, and I dove headfirst back into the hobby. My first box of miniatures was of a box of Space Wolves inspired by the Omnibus. The Space Marines that I always wanted when I was in middle school were the models that I could finally buy for myself. These Space Marines were what are now considered firstborn Marines. To me, they were the coolest thing in the world, and I built several armies of them. Then, suddenly, Games Workshop released the Primaris Marines and everything changed. Suddenly, the models that I thought were the coolest thing in the world were made inferior by new miniatures. It wasn't just the miniatures themselves, however, it was also the lore which made the standard Space Marines physically inferior to the Primaris Space Marines. With the new scale, the new miniatures, and the new lore surrounding the quality of Gene Seed, this change split the community apart. Suddenly, the miniatures that I had were squat, and I was an individual that wasn't adapting to these unnecessary cash-grabbing changes to a faction that I loved and was interested in since I was a teenager. Though GW initially said that it would not be replacing the standard Marines, they continued to make Primaris alternatives to every unit and even created entirely new ones. With each edition, GW led us by a string, keeping the Firstborn in the codexes but not updating their miniature sculpts and making them consistently under strength in comparison to Primaris Marines. These changes continue even to this day, as various Firstborn models are losing support units or otherwise are going into legend status. To be honest and somewhat direct, I don't really care what anyone else has to say on the matter. Primaris Marines are not only unnecessary, but they break everything that Warhammer 40k is supposed to be, specifically in regards to Space Marines, and if I seem monolithic for saying that, then I accept it. There was no reason to create Primaris Marines beyond 1. Legal possession of a Games Workshop specific brand of Space Marines, 2. The disassociation of various artists and designers who were part of the company and who were behind the narrative surrounding Firstborn miniatures, and 3. Their ability to make more money by influencing hobbyists who played Space Marines to buy a new army of Marines with bigger and quote-unquote better sculpts. They literally just could have taken what they had and made it bigger. Instead, they chose to completely redesign the faction. If I'm going to spend my money and rebuild my Space Marine army so that it matches the increased scale of the Warhammer 40k tabletop game, I'm going to spend it at a business that did what GW should have done, taken Space Marines and made them bigger without the drastic redesigning of the range. For me, that is Bolterjugend. Bolterjugend sculpts are similar enough to the traditional Firstborn miniatures to invoke a sense of nostalgia, but unique enough not to be exact copies of those same models. There are many companies doing the same thing, making sure that the Space Marine range of Firstborn miniatures continues, and I applaud all of them. But the second reason that I prefer Bolterjugend Space Marines is because they are closer to the true scale ideal of Space Marine miniatures. Before Primaris Marines, I was never concerned or interested in the idea of true scale Space Marines. It's only after Primaris emerged and people began to refer to them as true scale Space Marines that I became interested in the subject and did something of a deep dive into it, collecting various miniatures to compare and contrast their design. When Primaris Marines were released and people began to compare them to Firstborn miniatures, words like squat and tiny were used to describe the Firstborn miniatures, and people began to boldly state that Primaris Marines had better proportions. While this is a subjectively valid interpretation of the miniatures 100%, it's also not necessarily true. The standard for GW Space Marines is heroic scale, which is characterized by miniatures that have features which can be purposely seen from a distance. Features of such miniatures include large heads, large hands, large feet, and large weapons. The old Firstborn miniatures were made in this scale, but what a lot of people don't realize or won't accept is that Primaris Marines are also heroic scale, just at a larger size. Their proportions don't make any sense. Their heads are large, just like the old Firstborn. Their hands, feet, and weapons are also huge. The scale of the miniature has just been increased. Don't even get me started on their ridiculously thin waists. Once you see it, you won't be able to ignore it, and it becomes more elaborate with things like Joy Toy Primaris Marines. But why do GW Space Marines have these strange heroic scale based proportions? It's because GW Space Marine miniatures are not made to suggest the idea that there's actually a Marine in the armor. Instead, it presents the armor as if it is the Marine itself. That's why GW Space Marine head sculpts are as big as or bigger than the helmets, and why their bodies are overall strangely proportioned. A miniature range called House Barteth created miniatures representing Space Marines without armor. Though I'm not sure if it was intentional or not, when I ordered miniatures that I thought would be the same scale, I was actually sent unarmored Space Marines at different scales that ironically matched with the traditional Space Marine size and the size of a Primaris Marine. Not only do they accurately present the size difference between Firstborn and Primaris, but they actually show most of the exaggerations of heroic scale. Large hands, long arms, big feet, even the waists are accurate to GW miniatures, because if we go off of the miniatures as a representation of the Marine in the armor, then GW designs their Space Marine miniatures to have the bodies of bodybuilders, with which thin waists are common. The only thing that these unarmored minis have right about their proportions is the size of their head, but I'll get back to that in a minute. This comparison further elaborates on the fact that Primaris Marines are not true scale. They are heroic scale, just like the Firstborn Marine miniatures. However, I prefer Bolterjugend Space Marines because to me, they are closer to the ideal of true scale Space Marine miniatures. First and foremost, the miniatures made by Bolterjugend are intentionally thick. To me, the thickness of his sculpts accurately suggests that there is actually a Marine in the armor, and that the armor is actually armor, not a thin covering over the Marine body. Paul at Bolterjugend sometimes calls his miniatures fat, and to me his sculpts represent the possibility of a different visualization of unarmored Space Marines, which have the body type of a gray area between bodybuilder and strongman, one that actually shows strength, but also the brutal reconfiguration of Astartes' transformation. The thickness of his Space Marine miniatures also visually suggests the weight of the armor, especially in movement. The feet are not ridiculously huge. The hands are not ridiculously huge. The weapons are not too disproportionate to the body. The length of the lens are proportional to the body. The helmets are appropriately big, not disproportionately so. And that's also something I want to get into. What do I mean when I say that the helmets are not disproportionately big? If we take all of the elements of Astartes' physiology into consideration, despite their height of being around 8 to 9 feet tall, the size of Astartes' heads would still hypothetically follow the regular rules of anatomy, one of which being that taller bodies do not mean bigger heads. In fact, the portrayal of Space Marines with small looking heads has been a school of interpretation amongst many 40k artists for years. Space Marine faces are long and their skulls are thicker, but both do not mean that their heads are bigger than what is appropriate for the size of their body. It is my personal interpretation that large marines with small heads contributes greatly to the concept of transhuman dread that surrounds space marines, that feeling of horror and fear at seeing an Astartes, and it also explains why that effect is not described around Primarchs and Custodes, with them being designed differently. Going back to the unarmored Space Marine miniatures I showed earlier, if we compare their head sculpt to a standard GW Firstborn mini and a Primaris miniature, the unarmored Space Marine head seems tiny in comparison, but that's because it's one of the only features on the model that isn't displaying heroic scale proportions. I think it's easy to forget that if the helmet is one size, that means the head inside the helmet is smaller than the helmet. With GW Firstborn and Primaris miniatures, the heads are as big as the helmets, as if the helmets themselves are small, thin Halloween masks that can't really protect anything. If we are having a discussion about true scale Space Marine miniatures, the size of the Space Marine's head is also important. Not only would a true scale Space Marine miniature have the thickness enough to imply that the miniature represents a Space Marine in a suit of armor, but its head would also be accurately proportioned. This actually leads me into my third point for why I choose Bolterjugend, the freedom of scaling. With Bolterjugend, because they are 3D printed files, you can choose what scale you would like to print or have your miniatures printed at. You can have them in the current Age of Darkness scale, you can have them at Primaris scale, or you can even have them at Bolterjugend scale, which is even larger than Primaris Marines. 3D printing allows you to increase the size of miniatures and bits, but it also allows you to decrease scale. I mention this because if you wanted to have a bareheaded Space Marine with a true scale proportioned body, then you could find and shrink down head sculpts to the correct scale. This is actually part of the reason why my new Chapter Master model is such a big deal to me, because not only did I commission the custom head sculpt from Crusade's End, but True Scale Heresy was able to take the file and shrink it down so that it would hypothetically be able to fit into a Bolterjugend scale helmet, making it truly true scale. So these were 3 reasons why I prefer Bolterjugend miniatures to represent Space Marines. The continuation of Firstborn miniatures, the fact that to me they are closer to true scale miniature ideal, and the ability to scale them however I like. Bolterjugend has most generalized marks of armor available from Mark II to Mark VIII and are constantly updating their sculpts while simultaneously creating new ones. They also have 2 variants of Terminator-inspired armor available, though recently they updated their sculpts for their Indominus Terminator-inspired miniatures, which look really cool, and I plan to get my hands on them soon. There is a thriving community of Warhammer hobbyists who have turned to using Bolterjugend sculpts to create amazing Space Marines for tabletop gaming, whether they are used for 40k, Badab War, or the Horus Heresy. I think they're one of the best sculpt creators for Space Marine factions. His work, combined with the stunning upgrades by Corvinius Miniatures, create unique, imposing Space Marine miniatures on the tabletop, especially compared to standard human miniatures. Once you purchase the files, they are yours, and even if you don't have a 3D printer, Bolterjugend has a number of 3D printing allies who are licensed printers of his miniatures. I myself don't have a 3D printer, so I commissioned the 3D printing service TrueScale Heresy to print my miniatures for me. Not only does TrueScale Heresy print Bolterjugend miniatures, but they can print and rescale 3D upgrades from other designers and most other 3D printed miniatures you might need. Like I literally commissioned them to print a Primarch. Their customer service and communication are always amazing, and with their help, I've rebuilt my entire Void Lion army. I have so many miniatures by Bolterjugend and printed by TrueScale Heresy that they damn near sponsored this video, so I heavily recommend both of them, and I'll leave links in the description box below. Without anything else to say, Inquisitor Vaughn out. Remember, the Emperor protects and the future is successor.